Chapter 12. Searching for Daylight. I stood alone on the morning of December 20th, 1989, and gazed out from a promontory that gave me a cruel vantage point of the invasion. To one side, across the hills, I could look in the direction of Tinajita, where we had a major barracks. There was an aerial bombardment, the sound of tracers whooshing through the sky, small arms fire and explosions. The sky glowed and shook periodically. The invasion was in full bloom, and there was no means of control or coordination. After the confrontation at the airport and our escape from the 82nd Airborne's perimeter, we received a radio message from the man I identified as JF, detailing the points of enemy infiltration, including the possibility that some of our own bodyguards had been bought off by the Americans. I ordered dispersion of our forces in a mobile defense, along with the distribution of more than 2 tons of armaments, including rocket-propelled grenades and mortars. We shut down communications to avoid detection by radio monitoring. From that moment on, our forces initiated, according to plan, a variety of independent elite commando operations commanded by Captain Gonzalo Gonzalez, Captain Heraclide Sucre, Gaetan, Porfirio Caballero's explosive specialists, and the detachment of Alpha and Beta squads of the Silver Fox, one of our top men. For their own protection and concern about reprisals, I do not identify JF or Silver Fox here. We stopped at Balbina Perinan's house. She was on an official trip to Ecuador. A number of armed fighters were there, but we were pinned down in total darkness. In the distance, you could see flames coming from the direction of Torrio. You could hear the sound of planes and helicopters racing by, but all we could do was lie low and wait for daylight to see what was happening. I spent the night pacing, peering through the windows, listening to the explosions. Former President Solis Palma called from Venezuela at one point. Perinan answered, but the line cut off and the telephone no longer worked after that. San Miguelito offered a view across to Tinajita, but also down toward the city below. Suddenly, I saw tracer fire, the sound of weapons, and then a helicopter careening to the ground in flames. The fighting was particularly fierce in our vicinity. The general staff had gone to Tinajita, the last place the command should have gathered. The barracks was needed on a hill amid humble Panamanian homes. It took a pounding. The first attack at Tinajita missed the barracks and bombs fell among the nearby houses, killing civilians. The company based at Tinajita was known as Los Tigres, the Tigers. For a while, they were able to hold off the Americans. By 5:30 a.m., helicopter gunships had left the barracks in ruins. Bush and his cowardly war machine used Panama for target practice. Contending that they had to destroy our ability to fight them in the skies, for example, the U.S. Air Force chose the Rio Hato Air Base for the world's first wartime test of the stealth bomber. We were a proving ground for the Gulf War, which was to come later. Lacking any anti-aircraft support of any kind, a sense of impotence overcame the Panamanians, both regular Army members and the poorly armed members of the dignitary battalions, who had begun to put up a disorganized resistance. With our command structure cut, never expecting an air attack, Panama was unable to do anything against the world's greatest military power. Hardly a surprise. It was an overnight war, filled with Panamanian heroes facing insurmountable odds, filled with neighbors and friends tending to the needs of the fighters and their wounded, because they were patriots who believed they had the duty and the right to defend their homes, their land, and their countrymen. At dawn, there were many dead. In Panamanian terms, the invasion was the equivalent for us of Pearl Harbor, a strong and devastating aerial attack. Panama's Institute of Seismology reported 417 bomb explosions in the first 14 hours of the invasion. Had it been a land assault, we would have had the capacity to defend ourselves better. One thing is certain, the numbers of dead, Americans and Panamanians, had to be more than was reported by the U.S. military and the Panamanian opposition government installed by them. On the American side, an unreported number of helicopters went down. I saw 2 in San Miguelito. There were reports of 2 or 3 more during the attack on the Comandancia and in Panama Viejo, the ruins of the old colonial city of Panama, which was being used as a hideout where a small group of my men had been conducting nighttime raids and maintaining contact. When you start adding up these deaths along with the people killed at the airport in our skirmish, you get close to the total number of Americans reported killed during the entire invasion, 23. It had to be more. There was blood and destruction on the Panamanian side. Around the headquarters complex in Chorrillo, fire turned children, mothers, fathers, the elderly, entire families into ashes as they slept. People trampled the wounded as they fled the flames. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of dead, much more than the 320 people the Americans and their shameless Panamanian stooges claimed had died. No one has been able to determine the number of Panamanian dead. The Americans said that the Panamanians set fire to their own people in Chorrillo. What cynical, outrageous lies! The Americans painted a picture of the Dignity Battalions as gangsters who fought against their own people. This was pure propaganda, no better than anything the Nazis in Imperial Japan used against the Americans in World War II. At around dawn, we saw 3 Black Hawk helicopters descend in a field not far from the house. We assumed that they were deploying troops in the area. It was time to move. The only option was to circulate, look for our men, and to reconstruct a plan. We were using a taxi. I had changed from my uniform into civilian clothes. I was wearing jeans, a shirt, and a cap. I was also carrying a gun, some grenades, and other gear. We went out looking for Gaitan and his men, our special urban squads, but it was all chaos in Panama City. The Americans had knocked out long-distance communications. Television and radio had already been commandeered by them, and they were broadcasting propaganda and misinformation about the fight and about who had surrendered. They were using a Panamanian folk song called El Fugitivo as a signal that they hadn't found me yet. It was all psychological warfare controlled by the occupying forces. They would announce, so-and-so has surrendered and is at such and such an embassy, that liberation forces are mopping up isolated guerrilla operations in Colón. In between news items, they would play El Fugitivo. They still could not find me. We switched our base of operations to a house near the Church of San Francisco. I tried to strategize what to do next. One of those accompanying me voted for us to stop trying to fight. "Jefe, this isn't going to work," he said. "You have to go to the Cuban embassy. You'll be safe there. Face it, it's all over." I said no. The best thing was to set up operations in the mountains. I had received information telling me that the coast was clear to the Cuban embassy. My family was there, and I could have snuck in and taken asylum. We spoke by telephone with the Cuban ambassador, Lazaro Mora, who said he would accept whatever decision I made. "We've got to get to the hills and set up a base," I said. "We've got to regroup our forces." We made telephone contact with some of our political allies and proposed that we go to the presidential palace, but the majority didn't like the idea. We spoke with Darisnel Espino, who reported on a confrontation between U.S. soldiers and a group of Panamanian civilians and military led by Luis Cordoba and Nivaldo Madrinan, who were holed up in the Avesa building on Via Brasil Avenue. There was no rest. I had to find a way to escape the city. The next morning, the Americans were tightening their command of the situation. They had started house-to-house searches for anyone they could interrogate, and most of all, for information about me. After a while, it became too dangerous. We had to move. We operated between several safe houses and also used the cemetery in Rio Abajo. We had to be very careful for fear that any suspicious activity would tip off the Americans. We tried to stay away from windows to avoid loud conversation, to limit the use of running water and toilets. All we could do was wait for nightfall. More and more people were venturing out onto the street. American MPs were everywhere. We established a communications channel using 2 women, codenamed Micaela and Garganta. They forwarded messages to and from Micaela's husband, who stayed by the telephone. We received a report on the night of the 20th that 2 U.S. tanks and radio transmitters had been destroyed, and that there were several American casualties. We were able to confirm the transport of heavy weaponry to clandestine locations for eventual use against the invaders. 1 mortar operated for a time from the inner patio of the National Institute, the secondary school I once attended. While the new U.S.-installed government was being sworn in on a U.S. base in the old Canal Zone, units from the Machos del Monte Battalion launched an attack that blocked them from getting to the Legislative Assembly building. There were also several actions that were not carried out, including an attack in Colón on the Pedro Miguel locks. We denied permission to carry out this mission to avoid the death of Panamanian workers there. Also, 1 commando unit stormed the Marriott Hotel along the waterfront, seizing American journalists as hostages. Fortunately, the leader of the group did not harm them. The only journalist killed during the attack was a Spanish photographer killed by the American military. At one point, I got to a telephone and taped a message that was broadcast for a while on Radio Liberty, which still supported us. It was basically a rallying cry, calling on loyal Panamanians to oppose the invasion in any way possible. Mario Rognoni, a longtime member of the PRD and a strong supporter, was at the radio station, along with Ruben Murgas. Murgas and Rognoni said that the president, Francisco Rodriguez, had taped an on-the-air message as well. Now, Rognoni suggested, we should try a live broadcast. I agreed and we started talking. Within minutes, I heard a pop on the phone line and a tremendous explosion in the distance. The Americans monitoring the broadcast had bombed the radio station. I was left holding the phone. Rognoni, I found out later, was unhurt in the attack. The news was bleak and demoralizing. It was overwhelming. There were fewer and fewer reports of fighting, and most of the remaining resistance involved skirmishes or sniper attacks. I was trying to get to Chiriquí. Guerrilla action was the only alternative at this point, yet I wanted to be pragmatic. I was looking for odds in my favor. Although we had quite a good stockpile of ammunition, those responsible for distributing it had failed to do so, neither to soldiers at home, nor reservists, nor members of the Dignity battalions. None of our potential supporters was armed, although many were coming around looking for weapons. In Panama City and Chiriquí, scattered around the country were substantial stockpiles of weapons. The caches sat in hiding, unused and undetected. Chiriquí, Rio Hato, and Battalion 2000, for example, our best fighting units, had a cache of 60,000 rifles, 80 tons of ammunition, rocket launchers, and mortars. The invaders never discovered the stockpiles of guns, nor our ammunition stores. The head of the U.S. Southern Command, General Maxwell Thurman, Mad Max as his troops knew him, was simply speechless when our men finally surrendered and identified the arms stockpiles. Well, this all must have been contraband, intended for sale on the international market, he said. But he was wrong. It was our own material, for our own use. He never had a clue. Thurman died in 1995. If a rear guard had been able to organize in Chiriquí and Veraguas with commands in the other provinces, we might have regrouped. But all of our provincial commanders and staff were under tremendous pressure. General Mark Cisneros, the chief of the U.S. Army in Panama, was working with Archbishop McGrath to negotiate surrender without further resistance, reaching out to the zone commanders one by one, arguing that resistance was futile and would result only in more bloodshed. They threatened to bomb Chiriquí, Bocas de Toro, and other cities if the commanders did not surrender. What the church argued was perhaps true. Lives were saved. But it was also true that McGrath was a collaborator with an invading army. It was no surprise. He never considered himself a Panamanian. While all this was going on, Bush appeared on television to praise the invading troops and to say his cowardly invasion, all that a wimp with an inferiority complex could be capable of, was a liberation. The mission, he said, was to capture me and bring me to justice. He was lying. The Americans, with their 12,000 soldiers permanently stationed in Panama, didn't need to send another 20,000 men if the goal was really to capture me. If that were the case, they could send 100 men or Delta Force to capture me, or more likely, kill me. If killing me is what you want to do, you put a $1 million price on my head and pay somebody to do it. If you want to capture me, you offer the same $2 million you were going to pay me off with, and you save all the money that American taxpayers had to invest in their little invasion. The reason the Americans didn't do this was Orwellian. The Americans have a law that prohibits the assassination of foreign leaders. Evidently, of course, they have no law against invading a sovereign country and killing hundreds of men, women, and babies. No, the invasion was not intended to capture me. They wanted me dead in any case, like they had Premier Maurice Bishop of Grenada dead. The invasion was intended to destroy the Panamanian Defense Forces and to guarantee that the Panama Canal would be in the friendly, Anglo-loving hands of a Panamanian puppet government by the time it was to be turned over by the United States on December 31st, 1999. By Saturday, December 23rd, communications were isolated, and we could see that we were getting more and more hemmed in. We knew that the Americans were conducting house-to-house searches in their attempt to track me down. They launched attacks on one house in San Miguelito and destroyed the Torrijos Memorial House on Calle 50 and several others, based on information about where I had taken refuge. When the circle tightened even more, we moved to what I knew would be the safest place we could find, the cemetery at Rio Abajo. I was sure that the Americans would be too scared to go in there at night. Americans are afraid of death even during the day, let alone in the shadows. The best insurance is always to stay in a cemetery. It is time-tested and proven. But I know that after the Americans read this, they'll put it in their manual of procedures. Search the cemeteries overnight. They'll force a squadron of quivering soldiers to search every graveyard, and the men will be spooked beyond belief by the silence and peace they find there. Consider it a hint for the next invasion. The city was evidently subdued by the third night after the invasion. I heard almost no gunfire, only the sound of an occasional car, helicopters overhead, and the incessant engines of an airplane that was handling communications and tracking over the city. We were analyzing several options. First, I received information relayed from the same contact I had used as the invasion began. This time, from inside the U.S. Embassy came the message, "Exit battlefield, evasion and escape, or death." From the Cuban embassy came word that the situation was still dangerous and threatening, that American troops still had the building under siege. There was also word about at what time the guards surrounding the embassy would be fewer in number. Ambassador Mora approved of the option for us to go there, but my intuition told me to discard this option. I did not want to create a pretext for an American attack on the Cubans. I was in fact told later by the Vatican emissaries that Thurman said he would have attacked the Cuban embassy to take me into custody, understanding that this was a violation as flagrant as the Iranian occupation of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran 10 years earlier. The Libyan embassy was also threatened and under siege. Several of my escorts circulated in the city and were able to analyze the American roadblocks and the team searching for me. They came running back for me, fearing the worst. The city was surrounded and our escape route to Chiriquí was closed. We decided to move. Before doing that, however, a message was relayed to me that Monsignor José Sebastián Laboa, the papal nuncio, wanted to talk to me. I'd maintained contacts with Laboa previously, and we had gotten along well. He was trustworthy, I thought, being a man of the cloth, and not necessarily linked politically with the right-wing collaborationist archbishop. As I remember the Laboa episode, I recall what an acquaintance, businessman Roberto Papa Bobby Mata, said to me. "Tony, there are 3 kinds of truth in the world. Your truth, my truth, and the truth." Laboa's truth was that he was going to help me as a friend, having returned from his interrupted vacationing in Europe, and that he could pick me up undetected in his limousine and sneak me into the Vatican embassy for a meeting to discuss the situation. By this time, the city was so tight that travel with or without my disguise was impossible. He was to send a car to the parking lot of the duty-free store in Rio Abajo. We had taken a vantage point in our car that gave us a view of the parking lot without our having to go out into the open. At the appointed time, we sat in the car, watching the parking lot from a safe distance. The car hadn't arrived. We circled and went around the block, but there was still no car. "Let's get out of here," one of my escorts, Ulysses Rodriguez, said. "I don't think we should be doing this. It could be a trap." The 4th time we circled around, I decided to go out in the open and look for the car. They had told me that Laboa himself would be waiting for me. My plan was to use the car to get out of the area and not go with him to the embassy. With the diplomatic protection, I considered going to the hideout at Panama Viejo. I also knew that Lieutenant Colonel Cordoba and Lieutenant Colonel Madrinan were operating freely with his small squadron. I had other plans as well, but none of them included going to the Vatican embassy. From my perspective now, I'm convinced that Laboa unwittingly saved my life by diverting my plans. Finally, I saw the nuncio's limousine, the Vatican flag on the left bumper. I approached it and saw 2 men in front, a driver and a man I presumed to be Laboa. I opened the rear door. I looked more closely at the man in the bishop's robes and discovered that it was not Laboa, but Father Javier Villanueva, a Spaniard who was McGrath's aide and an outspoken opponent of mine. Also in the limousine was Laboa's secretary. My heart sank, and I might have bolted out the door had Villanueva not held out an explanation, and had I not seen that the man in priestly robes driving the car was actually a lieutenant from my security contingent. I felt somewhat relieved and smiled. "Monsignor Laboa sent me to come get you," Villanueva said, trying to allay my fears. "He's waiting for you at the nunciature." I felt a bit more relaxed, but I still didn't trust Villanueva. I knew that he had been one of those who had used the pulpit, in his case the Church of Cristo Rey, as a political forum, haranguing against the military and the government and calling openly for protests. I was still carrying my sidearm, some grenades, and an AK-47, and I brought them in the car with me. Ulysses Rodriguez started getting in the car too, but the man disguised in front stopped him. "You can't get in, only the general," he said in a gruff, hoarse voice. "Be careful," the escort said, and followed us. Just after getting into the car, we spotted a heavily armed convoy passing by, loaded with guns, rifles, and telescopic and night vision scopes. They headed straight for the dead-end street we had just driven out of minutes earlier. The Americans raided the chalet where we had stayed, but found few traces of my presence. A red beret with the word Commando written on it and a pair of black paratrooper boots I had worn. "Negative. Mission fugitive," the U.S. soldier reported back to the invasion headquarters. The special ambush operation had failed once more. In the confusion, we drove around without an obvious destination. "Are you going to take me where I want?" I asked Villanueva. "Let's meet with the Monsignor first. He's just come back to town to meet with you." Well, I thought, the Vatican Embassy is a safe haven, and there's no harm in going to talk to Laboa. Of my few options, at least it was an open door, although I was still not thinking of asylum. We drove along barricaded streets. The route was circuitous, but within minutes we had pulled into the courtyard of the Vatican Embassy. One of the first men I saw at the front door was none other than Eliezer Gaitan. "What's going on?" I asked him. "The nuncio is inside," was all he said. I was going to get my rifle, but Gaitan said he would get it for me. "I'll take it out when they put the car in the garage," he said. I went inside and encountered a busy scene. There were many other people there, all in civilian clothes. Those present included Father Velarde, who was our chaplain, Jaime Simmons, a prominent banker, and his children, Gaitan and 10 members of ETA, the Spanish Basque movement, who had been given asylum in Panama. There was also a strange Cuban man whom I didn't know. But once inside, they told me that Laboa wasn't there. "I've come to talk with Laboa," I said. "Where is he?" "He had to go out, but he'll be back," one of the bishop's aides said. I had little time to react to what he said, because I soon became aware of a distant rumbling sound, growing closer, gaining in volume. It was the sound of heavy equipment outside, tanks rumbling along the street. I started to go outside to retrieve my weapon. "Don't worry, we'll get it later," Laboa's secretary said. The limousine pulled away, and the sound of the machinery grew louder. Tanks were approaching the gates. What I had seen as an open door was a neatly designed trap, along with the prospect held out to me that something good would come of this. There were to be no negotiations, no simple little meeting, and there was evidently no escape. I was surrounded, thanks to the traitors working for the Americans.